Understanding Sociology. Richard T. Schaefer, author. Inside this chapter, we will cover these modules. Module 1, what is sociology? Module 2, the development of sociology. Module 3, the major theoretical perspectives. And Module 4, taking sociology with you. In this chapter, we learn how sociology developed, how it differs from the other social sciences. We'll go over what those are, who the pioneers of sociology were. We called these the big cheeses when I was in graduate school. So the major players, who are the major theorists, the early thinkers, what were the theoretical perspectives, the major theoretical perspectives in sociology, and also we're going to understand this concept called the sociological imagination and why it is important. Sociology is the study, or actually the scientific study of social behavior and human groups. That would be the major definition, or the most basic definition. So we focus, in sociology, we focus on social relationships, how they influence people's attitudes and behaviors, and we focus on how societies develop and how they change. Social change is a big part of sociology. This table illustrates the different sections of the American Sociological Association. The American Sociological Association is the major clearinghouse for all research and the different topics. And you can see by looking at this table a wide variety of topics that are studied within sociology. We have animals in society. We have rationality in society, religion, sex and gender, inequality, culture, race and ethnicity, race, gender, and class. And so medical sociology was a section I was involved in. I presented at a conference once in the medical sociology section, but I'm also interested in the family, and so that is an important section that I like to subscribe to, and education and things of that nature. So you could see there's so many topics, and maybe some might be of interest to you as well. So the range of sociological issues is very, very broad. And this is the primary organization that's responsible for providing information about sociology, the ASA, or the American Sociological Association. Now, I mentioned the sociological imagination, and this is a term that was coined by C. Wright Mills, and this is a way of thinking in an attempt to really understand social behavior. C. Wright Mills was an American sociologist who described this type of thinking as an awareness of the relationship between an individual and the wider society, and the ability to view one's society as an outsider would. It looks beyond a limited understanding of human behavior to see the world and its people in a new way, and see sort of through a broader lens, sort of broaden our perspective beyond our own individual experiences. So looking beyond, putting ourselves into someone else's shoes. So for example, when we think of sports in the United States, what usually comes to mind are baseball and soccer and football and hockey and basketball. Well, if we were in Bali, the fans may be cheering just as enthusiastically as they would, as we see at, say, an Eagles game on a Sunday afternoon. However, they could be cheering on a rooster. And roosters are trained and put into these fights against one another, and the fans exuberantly cheer for these roosters. Also, if you think about a country like Spain, and Spain have traditionally had bullfights in Spain, and so when you think about the bullfights and how, what realistically would that look like if it took place here in the U.S.? We may have, people for the ethical treatment of animals protesting a bullfight. Wouldn't realistically, the running of the bulls is another tradition. We wouldn't see the, that running. Could you imagine running down Broad Street in Philadelphia, bulls and people chasing after these bulls? Probably not. So realistically, you want to think about it from the perspective of those people in Spain and the long tradition, and try to understand it from their perspective. So that's what the sociological imagination entails. Another example, one last example, thinking about divorce. Another concept related to sociology of the family. And although it affects those who are personally involved, we use our sociological imagination and we challenge ourselves to think about how divorce affects a major social institution like the family. So we see something that's a very private concern that becomes a very public issue. It'll affect, children who are in schools. They set up guidance counselors, address any children who are experiencing the divorce of their parents. Government agencies, businesses, religious institutions, evolve, based on how to address this sort of issue. Single parent families, so we see a change in the structure of the family. Single parent families, step families, and so forth. And so it really reaches beyond just that personal experience. So again, to recap the sociological imaginations, by looking beyond our limited understanding of human behavior, we can see the world and its people in a new way, and we can see it through a broader lens, beyond our own individual personal experiences. Now, sociology is considered a social science. The term science refers to a body of knowledge that is gathered or obtained by methods based on systematic observation. Just like other sciences, sociology involves organized, systematic study, whereas the natural sciences studies the physical features of nature and the ways they interact and change. Chemistry, you can have two chemicals, combine them together, and how does that physically change? Well, social science studies the social features of humans and the ways that they interact and they change. So for some examples of the natural sciences, we have astronomy and biology and chemistry, geology, physics. But some of the social sciences are things like anthropology. We see past cultures and the origins of humans. We see a whole list. I'm going to actually advance this slide. But social science disciplines all focus on that social behavior of people, but each has a particular orientation. So again, anthropology looks at past cultures and the origins of humans. Economics looks at the production and exchange of goods, money. So we're looking at finances of people. History, it looks at events that happened in the past. Again, a social science. What happened in our history? Whereas psychology looks at the personal and individual behaviors. So it's more of individualistic study. Political science looks at the workings of government, exercise of power, and the international relationships. So in contrast to all these, other social sciences, sociologists study the influence that society has on people's attitudes and behaviors. Now, the common focus to all these are the social behavior of people, but again, it's taken from a very differing perspectives. In sociology, we seek to understand ways in which people interact and shape society. We examine these relationships scientifically. So sociologists study the influence that people have on society, people's attitudes and behaviors in society, the ways we interact and shape society, and these social relationships. We examine them scientifically. We're going to talk about the scientific method in Chapter 2. So for example, the 2008 recession, its impact on both marital patterns and education. So that's one example. So if you look at how that recession actually impacted people's, whether or not they went back to school, maybe they were in school and they had to drop out because of the cost. So we want to look from a sociological perspective and study how marital patterns may have changed or how educational enrollment may have changed. On one hand, we saw the change or delay in the median age that people were getting married. So people would postpone their marriage, plans because, maybe they were trying to save up the money, or they lost their job and they needed to, maybe go back to school and reinvent themselves. So you see how there's a domino effect on, something like a recession that could then impact people's experiences. The role of social media for extremist thought. This example, it relates to how people get mobilized through social media to join militant groups or extremist groups and really organize themselves in that manner. Another thing is the social effects of hurricanes or any natural disasters. And this example is Harvey and Irma in 2017, but there have been quite a few other natural disasters. So you want to see, what was the community, sociologists would study, what was the community like before the natural disaster? Was there poverty in certain areas? Was there, what was the infrastructure like? And then once the natural disaster, hits, how does the community come together, and what do we need to do to rebuild in those communities? And so sociologists play a big part in the recovery efforts, in studying the communities and then bringing forth their suggestions on different recovery efforts. So, sociologists have a long history of advising government agencies, various, disasters, natural disasters, incidents like, Columbine and cases like that where there have been mass shootings in various areas. So we see that quite a bit, and that's what sociologists do become involved in. They sort of help agencies in that manner. Now, a lot of people refer to what we study as, well, that's common sense. Sociologists do not accept something as fact just because everyone knows it. Common sense knowledge is not always reliable. And many think that what we study is just common sense. Well, everybody knows that. But common sense is mostly unreliable and oftentimes can be inaccurate. So each piece of information that we study, that we examine, must be tested, recorded, and analyzed. So, scientific studies are used to describe and understand our social environment, and we study it in a scientific manner. Now, typically, researchers have theory in mind. So we're next going to talk a little bit about sociological theory. A theory is a set of statements that seeks to explain problems, actions, or behaviors. Effective theories can be explanatory and predictive in nature, which means they can explain something, but they can also predict something. Theories are not final statements about human behavior. Differences can occur. So that's why we constantly revise and add to some theories and create new theories. So let's think about, for an example, Emil Durkheim, who's a sociologist. So Emil Durkheim developed a theory to explain how individual behavior, suicide, something very individual, very personal, can be understood within a social context. So Emil Durkheim decided to study suicide data scientifically, and he studied in different parts of Europe. His theory on suicide both explains and predicts which groups are most at risk for suicide. This was done over 100 years ago. So his research suggested that although it is a solitary act, suicide is related to group life. Suicide rates reflect the degree to which people are integrated into the group life of society. So he looked at various ways that people are integrated through their family life, through religious life, through their economic life. Do they have a job? Are they working? So religious affiliation, marriage, economic stability, all played a part in what he studied. And he found that, if you were single, you were more at risk of suicide. If you are non-religious, or even dependent on which religion you belong to, and whether or not you were unemployed, you had a job, or financial difficulties could play a part. So these social forces and any changes in those social forces, he found, could impact a person's being at risk for suicide. Modern research reveals similar patterns. So if you examine, say, for example, a place like Las Vegas, people travel to Las Vegas. There's a lot of casinos there. And so think about what that place is. It's very transient. People come in and out of that location. They're going to gamble, so chances are they may win a lot of money, but they also may lose a lot of money. And so finances become an issue there. So low-level community, cohesiveness, those are the things he's looking at. So we see high suicide rates also that happen in a place like Las Vegas. So any current research that was done in that area kind of supports Emil Durkheim's theory. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is the development of sociology. How did sociology develop? In the beginning, we had philosophers and religious authorities who basically sat around and made observations and talked and looked at people and how they interacted. It wasn't necessarily recording anything. They just sort of made the observations about the people around them. Then, in the 19th century, European theorists contributed to the development of the science of human behavior. So we're going to see with our early thinkers how that started to happen. Because you see, we have to realize that theory, so if we develop theories develop and research, they cannot be these separate processes. In order to build a sociological theory, we must examine relationships. We must observe, make observations between bits of data that we gather through research. And this might, sort of enable and sort of allow us to develop our theories. So this data may seem unrelated, but in fact, if we start to examine it, incorporate our theory, we see that there's definitely these relationships. And so when our early thinkers started to really observe these different bits of data that they were looking at, we call it data now, but back then they were just making these observations. They sort of began to really start to think more and sort of concretely analyze it and sort of record it. Okay, so our first and earliest thinker is Auguste Comte, and we often refer to him as the father of sociology because he coined the term sociology that refers to the science of human behavior. And he believed that a theoretical science of society and a systematic investigation of behavior was needed to improve society. So this was just around the, just after the French Revolution. So if you look at the dates, you're not going to have to memorize these dates, but it's important to know when these thinkers were alive, when they were thinking, and what was going on in the world. And this was right after the French Revolution. So if you know a little bit about the French Revolution, in fact, if you just look at the film or the play, the Les Miserables, you can get a really good visual on what the French Revolution was. You've had people who owned the means of production, you had factory workers, and how they interacted with one another. So you've seen a lot of change. You've seen a lot of people in poverty, and you see some people with a great deal of wealth. And so what was going on at that time? And that's when Auguste Comte was around. Next, we have Harriet Martineau. And Harriet translated Comte's work. So she studied social behavior in both Britain and in the United States. She emphasized the impact of economy, law, trade, health, and population, and that its impact on various social problems. If you think about population, crowded, densely populated areas, how does that influence social problems? You've got, a lot of people live in closely congested areas. They could have some, serious health issues and crime and things of that nature. So she examined all that, and she was very much what we consider in sociology a methodologist. She wrote the very first book on sociological methods. She spoke out for women's rights. She spoke out for the emancipation of slaves and for religious tolerance. So, again, as a female woman at this time period, she was very well, outspoken about various rights. And her view is that you should not just make observations. You should take action for change. So a lot of our early thinkers who were female really spoke about social change, doing something with that information. Next, we have Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer studies, very controversial, and he studied evolutionary change in society. And he adapted Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest view. Now, he had hoped to understand society better, but not to improve it. He argued that it is natural that some people are rich while others are poor. So again, you can see how controversial his ideas. So he applied Darwin's work on evolutionary, studying of species. Charles Darwin, again, was thinking around the same time period, 1857 to 1859, and looking at evolutionary approaches to society and how things change over time. Now, this view is known as also social Darwinism, and it's very controversial when you think about, we should let things be, it's natural for some people to be rich while it's natural for some people to be poor. And we shouldn't do anything to upset that that form of society. And those vested in it liked it, and those were probably the rich people. Well, most opposed it and sought change. So those people who were disadvantaged would seek out that social change. Now, there's some, writings that say that actually it was Herbert Spencer who coined the term survival of the fittest. So there's debate on who actually coined that term first, but both have used it and both have adapted it into their theories. Here we have Emil Durkheim. And we have mentioned him already in his study of suicide, but he did quite a bit of work in our discipline. He stressed that behavior must be understood within a larger social context. So he's very much a macro sociologist, and I'll explain what macro sociology is. So he did not think things were very individualistic or psychological. We need to look at behavior in the larger social context, not just in the individualistic or psychological terms. He concluded that religion reinforces a group's solidarity, which is, again, discussed in his study of suicide. He wrote about industrial societies as well. So he really did not just limit his interest to any one aspect of society. He studied suicide. He studied religion. He studied the division of labor. He studied crime. And these are really thick, dense pieces of work that he wrote. So again, his key interests focused on the consequences of work in modern society. So really, his work on the division of labor in society was his doctoral thesis that he wrote in 1893. So in this piece of work, in the division of labor, he discussed when tasks become very highly specialized as we move toward industrialization. And he said this leads to what he called anomie. We're going to discuss what that is. So anomie, according to Durkheim, is this loss of direction in society that we feel when social control of individual behavior has become ineffective. And this occurs during times of really profound social change, during times of an economic recession, during a time when somebody may be laid off from work, even during, if you're working and you're in a mundane kind of job where your tasks are just, limited. You're part of an assembly and you're in a office cubicle and you're just doing your tasks. So you really just are feeling this loss of purpose, loss of direction, normlessness. So anomie is that state of normlessness. People feel a loss of direction in a society when social control is ineffective. There's a sense of alienation, isolation, and Durkheim feared this for us in industrial society. And here we have Durkheim and his studies of religious life, suicide, and the division of labor in society. Now, at around the same time, we find Max Weber. And Max Weber was a German sociologist who said that researchers need Verstehen in their work. And Verstehen, German term, obviously, is a German word for understanding, but a deep level of understanding or insight. So in order to, comprehend behavior, we must learn the subjective meanings that people attach to their actions. So in order to comprehend, understand behavior, we must learn the subjective meaning. And in order to do this, we need to really get to the meaning that person attaches to. That is how they themselves view and explain their behavior, not how we interpret it, but how does that person really view what's going on. So Weber used the term ideal type, and he's known for this as well, ideal type, to provide a useful standard for measuring an organization, the family, religion, or even economic systems. And so sort of an ideal type is sort of a model or construct that we sort of use to evaluate specific cases, sort of a standard that we use. Now, Durkheim and Weber never really met, nor did they know of each other's existence, but they sort of were thinking and operating in and around the same time. Weber's work, in fact, was a response to the work of Karl Marx. Here we have Max Weber. He wrote The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and he also wrote The Economy and Society. And here we have Karl Marx. And illustrated here is his little manifesto, his Communist Manifesto, which he wrote with Friedrich Engels. Very stark contrast to his it's a very thin piece of work, but then you see his Capital, Das Kapital, which is like a huge, thick piece of literature. So Karl Marx was also German. But he was expelled. He was also very poor. People know that he was also very poor. And what he believed is that society is divided between two classes that clash in pursuit of their own interests, their self-interests. So it's sort of these classes that are even in competition for scarce resources. And he worked with Friedrich Engels. They emphasized what is known as group identification and associations that sort of influence a person's place in society. So together they wrote the Communist Manifesto, and they saw the factory as the center of conflict between the owners of the means of production, who are known as the bourgeoisie, and the workers who worked for the owners, who were exploited by the owners. We call them the proletariat. Now, Marx and Engels argued that the working class should unite, overthrow the class system and capitalist society. So in essence, they felt that group identification and associations influenced an individual's place in society. So it's the owners versus the workers. It's, you've got this economic, social, political relationships that allow owners to maintain their power and dominance over the workers. So again, you see that clash, that conflict. Now, this is just one format in many economic, but also the social relationships, our political relationships. See it manifested in many different areas. So his writings inspired many others who would later lead communist revolutions in Russia, China, Cuba, and other countries. Again, emphasizing how that group identification can influence a person's place in society. Now, just a little background gossip, I guess you can call it, about Karl Marx. He never really considered himself a sociologist. And he never would have said that, he was a communist. But his ideas and his workings, his theory, have been applied to that work. And so again, we see how it inspired others in the Communist Party. So he wrote the Communist Manifesto, that's that small little pamphlet, and then Das Kapital, which I think is in 2 volumes. I believe I have both volumes on my shelf. Now, as we move toward more modern developments in thought, we have W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was an early Black sociologist in the United States. He believed that knowledge was essential to combating prejudice and discrimination and to achieve tolerance. He assisted in the struggle for a racially egalitarian society. So he advocated research on the lives of Blacks in the United States. He helped found the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He conducted in-depth studies of urban life in both Philadelphia and Atlanta, Georgia, focusing on religion at the community level. In fact, there is a church in Philadelphia on, I believe it's 6th and might be between Lombard and South, if you're ever familiar with the Philadelphia area. I grew up in Philadelphia, so I used to pass by this area, and there's a plaque, even one of those mural arts program that is depicting our sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois and all the work he contributed to sociology and to our understanding of social behavior, particularly in the African American community in that area, within that religious community. He also coined the expression double consciousness. This is an important idea. It refers to the division of a person's identity into 2 or more social realities. So according to Du Bois, This concept reflected the experiences of Blacks and African Americans living in predominantly white America. W.E.B. Du Bois graduated Harvard. He was a Harvard University graduate. He wrote a number of pieces of work, the Philadelphia Negro. He actually was an assistant of sociology for a year at the University of Pennsylvania. So he was, worked in the Wharton School. And he's well known for, again, in that community near 6th and South, where that church is, he went door to door doing face-to-face interviews, knocking on people's doors and interviewing them based on, the study he was working on, religion and, the religious community in Philadelphia. And here we have W.E.B. Du Bois. This is some of his works: The Philadelphia Negro, The Negro Church, and Souls of Black Folk. He basically was publishing a publication a year. That's how much he was writing at the time. He suffered in the face of discrimination and prejudice, going to ASA conferences. So he would attend these conferences and, faced head-on, discrimination. He was not allowed to eat in the same restaurants as the predominantly white sociologists or stay in the same hotels at the time. And so at one point, again, this is just some background, his passport was taken away temporarily so that he couldn't travel and spread, his ideas. So I think ultimately he did travel to Ghana, which is where he's been laid to rest, in Ghana. But again, great many works that he contributed to sociology, the field of sociology. Now on to more 20th century developments. Sociologists in the United States have also contributed greatly to our understanding of the workings of society. And here we have Charles Horton Cooley, who was actually originally an economist. And he used the sociological perspective to examine face-to-face groups. He's very much a micro-sociologist. And Cooley increased our understanding of group dynamics and the way that these dynamics shape people's ideals, beliefs, their values, their behavior patterns, and even their sense of self-identity. So he looked at small units. He looked at families, friendship networks, gangs. He studied, very small group interactions. We'll talk more about him in future chapters. Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams was a social reformer. Again, so I said many of our early women in the field of sociology were all about social change and social reform. And she combined intellectual inquiry, her curiosity with social service work and political activism. She combined these two to assist the underprivileged and create hopefully to create a more egalitarian society, things that would be more equal. She won a Nobel Peace Prize for her work. In 1889, she co-founded Chicago's Hull House, Hull, Hull House, with Ellen Gates Starr. And this was a settlement house for the poor at the time. And it was located not far from the University of Chicago, which is where quite a few of our early sociologists came from. And so a lot of them would contribute and work and volunteer at Hull House. Also, she worked with another well-known women's rights activist at the time, Ida Wells Barnett, and they successfully together prevented racial segregation in the Chicago's public schools. So they worked closely together. Ida Wells Barnett was, again, a very early, well-known sociologist and activist. Jane Addams' work is an excellent example if we were to talk about applied sociology, which we'll define towards the end of this chapter. Applied sociology is about, promoting social change, using your knowledge and what you learn and what you research about in order to promote positive social change. And next we have Robert Merton. Robert Merton was born in Philadelphia. He actually went to Temple University, which is also my alma mater. I'm an alumni from there. And so he contributed to sociology, and his major contribution was to combine theory and research. He's well known for the idea of being a role model and the self-fulfilling prophecy, and how social roles are central to his theory. He looked at how our roles in society are central. So he developed this key theory to explain also deviant behavior. He's got a theory on deviance, which we will get to in chapter 6. He developed this explanation. Deviance is behavior that violates our social norms. And so he analyzed and studied deviance, and he believed that we should bring together the macro level and the micro level sociological approaches. So I mentioned these already, but I wanted to really now define them as they relate to Merton's early thinking. And macro sociology focuses on very large scale phenomenon or entire civilizations, and how do these large scale influences affect people and their behavior and their values and their attitudes and their interactions. So it concentrates on large-scale phenomenon. So again, if you think about Durkheim's as an example of this, Durkheim's study of suicide. Immediately we think of it something that happens to an individual. But if we study it from a macro sociological perspective, we're taking a look at how is that individual integrated into the larger society. What societal influences impact that individual that put them at risk for suicide? What's going on in their family life? Are they religious? Are they connected in the community? Do they have a job? So what is their economics of that, that are impacting that individual? Microsociology, on the other hand, stresses the study of small groups, often through experimental means. We can look at things through, how are these individuals interacting. So you would look at that same study of suicide, but if you're taking it from the microsociological perspective, you'd want to look at how does that individual's at-risk behavior impact his ability to find a job, or his interactions, within his family, if he's struggling to, what's impacting his life that causes strain and stress within his marital relationship or any other relationships. So it's looking at the same concept but from a different vantage point. We think about, divorce in a similar manner. Again, very individualistic and personal experience, but it can impact society as a whole by changing the structure of the family. Or what's going on in society can impact the family that would result in people's dissolutions of their marriages. Here are some additional levels of sociological research that are kind of new to this edition of the textbook. And the first is mesosociology, and that focuses on formal organizations and social movements. We think about what's going on in society today, and this approach would look at how are those we all at some point are going to be working in a formal organization in some way, possibly if you're a nurse and you're working at a hospital. If you're an accountant and you're working for a firm, you're going to be involved in an organization that has rules and regulations, and that you need to, so they influence us. Again, social movements, when there are injustices, people are going to be, looking for social change, and so that ultimately, if those changes can occur. They will result in changes in affecting people's behaviors and attitudes. Global sociology, again, is another level of research and perspective that looks at different nations, studying entire societies and looking at it from a more global perspective. And here we have Pierre Bourdieu, very complex individual. In fact, most of his works are written in French and that's translated. So I have to say, very firsthand, it can be very dense material to read through. But the gist of his theory, our understanding of his theory is, again, he was a French sociologist, and his theory is in terms of capital. So according to Bourdieu, capital is what sustains people and families from one generation to the next. Capital includes not just material goods, not just financial assets, but also cultural and social assets. I'll give you some examples of these in a moment. And he wrote about these different forms of capital. Capital has many forms. It could be include things like knowledge, prestige, culture, formal schooling, social connections. Who do we know that provides us with that additional capital? Our cultural capital is, according to Bourdieu, what are non-economic goods. These are things that are related in our knowledge of language and our knowledge of the arts, our family, our backgrounds. Do we come from a higher class that incorporates a lot of capital in terms of our experiences, where we can go to view art and music and incorporate all that, different languages, different knowledge base, higher levels of education. That's kind of a capital that people have in terms of what their family background can provide for them, their education, being a social elite. And social elites value this type of capital. Having more of this capital can put you in a higher perspective, higher social class. The social capital is the collective benefit of these networks, of the who do we know, which are these things are built on reciprocal trust, reciprocation. Somebody who works somewhere, puts you at more of an advantage to be on the know of what's going on at a company. Or maybe they're hiring people in that sense. So it provides opportunities, having this sort of capital. That's sort of, in a nutshell, the idea of capital when it comes to what Bourdieu wrote about. Okay, now in Module 3, we're going to talk about the three major theoretical perspectives. And these are the most widely used perspectives: functionalist perspective, conflict perspective, and interactionist perspective. There are others we're going to talk about, but if I were to ask what the three major, most widely used perspectives in sociology are, it would be these three. So first we're going to talk about the functionalist perspective. In this view, society is like a living organism in which each part of the organism contributes to its survival. So it emphasizes the way that the parts of society are structured to maintain its stability. So some of the key words in the functionalist perspective are social stability, the structure. It's actually often referred to as structural functionalism. How are the parts of society structured, and how do they function? And so a lot of times I'd like you to think about an example of, think about the human body and all the parts that we need to be structured where they are, our heart, our lungs, our liver, our spleen. Our spleen is there. It serves a purpose. I don't know what that is, but maybe some of you medical students would be better. But each part at some point we need, and those parts need to be functioning. So if you go to the doctor, you're feeling, short of breath, you're feeling lethargic, you go to the doctor, they take your blood pressure up, so your blood pressure is high or your blood pressure is low. Something's off. You're not stable. So the doctor needs you to get stable again. So that's sort of the way you want to think about it. You've got all these parts, and that's how the theorists looked at the functionalist perspective, comparing society with, the human body. So Talcott Parsons, who's this gentleman here in this corner, was the key player in this theory, key theoretical, thinker. He viewed society as this network of these connected parts. So each part helps to maintain the system as a whole. I think your book provides an example too of cow worship in India. Some, are hard to understand. Well, cow. Why do people in India worship a cow? Well, the cow serves a function in that society. Cows plow the fields. They produce milk. You can't eat a cow. You need them. So they're allowed to actually walk freely in the marketplaces. If you see pictures, there's pictures of them just freely walking around in the markets. So it's, when this serves a function, it would be hard for them to understand how many people in the United States actually, eat and consume cow and beef and so forth. Now there are different types of functions, particularly two types of functions and then a dysfunction. We have manifest functions and latent functions. So just to distinguish, we're going to talk about how a manifest function is an openly stated conscious function that involves intended and recognized consequences. You know what a specific aspect of society is for, what its function is. So let's just use education as an example. Schools. We know that they serve a function. Schools are intended to educate. That's a manifest function. That's an openly stated conscious function of the institution of schools, education. Now, there are also latent functions. These are unintended consequences of an institution, and they may often reflect some hidden purposes. But if we use our example of schools and education, we may say that, hey, you're going to make friends. It's not intended, but we often make friends in school. You're sharing, a lot of time together, you're studying similar things, and you might meet someone that you develop friendship with, or maybe a long-term relationship or partnership with. That would be considered a latent function. They don't say that in the rules when you're registering for your school, for your classes, or when your parents, enrolled you in elementary school. But in the, as a latent function, as an unintended consequence of school's function, we often do meet our friends when we go to school. So these are unconscious or unintended functions that may reflect hidden purposes of the institution. A dysfunction is an element or process that may disrupt the social system, reducing its stability. That's what that says there. Elements or processes of society that can disrupt the social system or reduce stability. Things like crime in society, homicides, murder, things of that nature. That's a dysfunction in society. Or if we use the education example, which we were following, underage drinking on college campuses. That's a dysfunction of society. It happens, young students who are not of age yet are mingling with older students who are of legal age. And so these things often happen. So that would be considered a dysfunction of the educational system because we see underage drinking occur. Next, we have the conflict perspective. Now, this perspective assumes that social behavior is best understood in terms of conflict or tension between groups. And these are actually competing groups. Conflict theorists are interested in how society's institutions maintain privileges for the upper classes and keep others in more subservient positions. It's often referred to as the Marxist view because Karl Marx is so closely associated with this perspective. So the Marxist view is that conflict is part of everyday life in all societies. So, for example, yes, we are competing for resources, the allocation of resources, but there's also racial inequality, there's also gender inequality in addition to our class differences. So every day there are these, if you think about even age, competing for a job. So you're a young person, you're fresh out of college and you want to apply for a job, but you've got people who are retirement age who aren't retiring. They lack the resources to be able to retire from their work, so they're still working, and so there may not be positions. So there's, again, a competition based on age for the allocation of resources. So that's all about the understanding it from a conflict perspective. So again, here we have different forms of tension, labor negotiations, different labor unions. Unions that kind of fight for employees in terms of their benefits and things on their job and sort of support and help them. Party politics, differences between Democrats and Republicans and all the different political parties. Competition for religious group membership. You see a lot of churches trying to bring in and recruit people into their religions, and those different religious groups competing based on their ideals. Budget disputes, all sorts of things create these tensions among groups. So again, we said the conflict perspective is sort of also known as the Marxist view. It's sort of because it's based on the work of Karl Marx, and it's viewed as a part of everyday life. Conflict is evident in everyday life. So conflict theorists really focus on how social institutions maintain that privilege and subservience of different groups. It does emphasize social change. As a result, social change can happen when you have this conflict. It emphasizes that redistribution of resources, and there are much more radical than functionalists in terms of, functionalists will see how things function and are structured, but conflict theorists will actually promote social change. Derived from the conflict perspective, we have two additional theories, the feminist theory and even queer theory. So first, the feminist theory. And this is derived from the conflict perspective, gender inequality being central to all behavior and organization. Now here we have, again, Ida Wells Barnett, who was most associated with this perspective. The focus is on the macro level. So again, looking at what's going on in society that will impact gender inequality. So this is a perspective that's broadened in a view of social behavior, expanding our analysis beyond just the point of view of males. So looking at women's subordination that's inherent in capitalist societies. Intersectionalities is a concept we see where there's a matrix of domination where all of these social factors sort of converge. And I'll show you an illustration of this. It's sort of this interlocking matrix where a person's race and gender and age and sexual orientation, even their religion, even disability, sort of help determine their privilege or lack of privilege. And so we see how all these different social factors can converge. We call that intersectionalities. queer theory is, again, a new theory is introduced to these more current editions of this text. And in 1978, Michel Foucault said that human sexuality varies from culture to culture, and it varies over time. What is considered normal or acceptable varies. The term queer is not used as a derogatory term here. It is, in fact, a term of empowerment, where it once was used to enforce a stigma. So gay and lesbian activists argue that studies of society are incomplete if they do not include the full spectrum, that broad spectrum of sexual identities. Heterosexuality no longer is viewed as the only normal, so-called normal form of sexuality. So we get queer theory as the study of society from this perspective, in this broad spectrum of sexual identities, to include heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. So, Michel Foucault wrote that what is acceptable human sexuality varies, and it varies between cultures and over time. Eve Sedgwick was another individual who argued that analyzing society would be incomplete without including the broad spectrum of sexual identities. Now we have the interactionist perspective. And this perspective generalizes about everyday forms of social interaction to explain society. Okay, so this is a very micro level perspective. So we're going to explain society as a whole through our small group social interactions. It's also referred to as symbolic interaction because of the emphasis on symbols, that we use symbols in society. And humans are viewed as living in a world of meaningful objects or symbolic objects. These meaningful objects can be material things, they can be actions, they can be other people, they can be our relationships, and they can also be symbols. So, for example, I often show in class the fact that I wear a ring on, this ring finger on this particular hand, and most everyone, raises their hands. I ask, what kind of ring is this? And we all understand the symbolism of a ring here as a symbol for marriage, and that somebody is married or wedded to another person. So symbols are our basis of human communication. So this communicates that I am married, but also could be wearing, I could also have a tattoo. I don't, but many people have tattoos that symbolize or have some sort of meaningful expression that they share. It could be very personal, but it can also be something that's very outward. A piece of jewelry, the way we wear our hair, the clothes we wear, all symbolize something meaningful. And in order for it to be understood or have that we have to have that shared meaning. The symbols must be shared to all the members of society. So anyone who is wearing, say, a piece of jewelry that represents a religious faith, say a cross or a Star of David, a person who is in that particular religion understands the meaning behind that symbol, and it's a shared meaning between people within a Christian faith or a Jewish faith. Just to give you an example. Also, we have nonverbal communication. So again, symbols are these important things related to this perspective. Symbols are especially important in the interactionist perspective. It's central to our communication. Having that shared understanding of what those symbols mean is central to being able to communicate. If you don't have that shared meaning, communication will fall and you will not be able to communicate. Do you ever try to speak to somebody who speaks a different language? You don't understand each other, and so communication breaks down, and you go your way, they go their way, unless you figure out another way to communicate. So sharing meaning through even nonverbal communication. Say you're visiting a foreign country and you don't know the language, but you need to eat, you're hungry. So maybe you go into a restaurant and you see a menu and hopefully it has pictures, or you point to items on that menu that you could figure out and show that this is what you'd like to order so that you can eat some food. So nonverbal communication, our gestures, our facial expressions, our body language, the way we sit, how if we look bored. If I were, giving this lecture in class, sometimes I can look up and see, students, do they look bored, or, is it time to end class because, things are getting a little bit too lengthy. So all of these things sort of express meaning, and for it to have that shared understanding is what will maintain our social interactions and our communication. So I have a whole list of, different examples of this. Tattoos I mentioned already. Dress codes, if you're attending class and you're going to class, you could be a little bit more casual than if you were going to an interview for a job. You might want to put on something more formal to take, to show that you're serious about, getting this job in this position. So you would dress accordingly. Or even if it's, if you're just going to hang out with your friends versus you were invited to a wedding, which is a little bit more formal and dressy, you would dress differently depending on where you're going. Athletes also need to be quite mindful too, how they dress and how they conduct themselves, because they set such a high example, and many young people, athletes often look up to them, and so many athletic organizations encourage their athletes to sort of follow a dress code outside of the arena where they play, whether it be baseball, basketball, football. So these symbols, they're maintained, and these symbols are often maintained in a lot of areas. Okay, a couple more theorists. Interactionist perspective theorists. George Herbert Mead, again, an American sociologist. He's regarded as the founder of this perspective. Again, this is one of my favorite perspectives because he influenced our thinking at a micro level. I really like to examine things from that micro level of behavior, small group behavior, friends and family members, and those sorts of interactions. So he influenced this thinking. Also, we have, and we'll talk more about him as we move further through the text. Erving Goffman is another theorist in this perspective. He was a Canadian sociologist and developed what is known as a dramaturgical approach. And what he did was he compared the actions of individuals in everyday life to actors performing on a stage. So if we look at, we think about the parts that we play. We all play a part if we were, say, for example, in class. In class, I'm playing the part as your instructor, and you are playing the part as a student. Now, if we were in a different, institution, say we were at the dentist, and you are either a dentist or a dental hygienist, and I'm coming in for an appointment, we are playing a different part, a different role. And so you would be the dentist and I would be your patient. So it depends on where we are, the part that we play. Or if we, again, taking that student, instructor, teacher role. In the classroom, it's a little bit more formal, but outside of the classroom, when class is over, if I see you in the hallway, it's a little bit more informal and it's more casual, more relaxed. You can be more relaxed if you're hanging out with your friends in the cafeteria or the lounge versus when you're sitting in classroom and you have to be alert to what's being taught in the classroom. So again, Goffman is known for this dramaturgical approach, how we play these parts, like we're actors on a stage, and he compared that to our everyday life. And he also discusses the presentation of self, and we'll talk about that as we get into the socialization and future chapters. So you'll see these guys again. All right, to kind of get to a point where wrapping things up, the sociological approach, we make use of all the perspectives. We don't just, focus on one and that's it. There's no one right perspective. We take them all to kind of gain this broad understanding of society. No one approach is correct. They sort of even overlap, some of them. Each perspective offers unique insights into the same issue. So you could take an issue like sports and analyze it. I think your text actually does that. It breaks down each perspective and how they would examine sports as an institution. So I recommend that you actually look at that chart in your textbook. I have the page number here for you, but it is it could be on around page 18-19. You want to check in your text. It really goes through sports according to the 5 theoretical perspectives. So it looks at functionalist perspective and how it maintains a person's well-being. So there's a function for sports for young people. And a conflict perspective, it looks at sports as a business, as a big business. A lot of money is made through sporting events. From a feminist perspective, we want to look at are there inequalities in sports? I remember there being a court case for soccer, the women's soccer team that were fighting for inequality in the gender wage gap. So, feminists might want to look at sports from that perspective. And then the interactionist perspective, maybe you're going to examine sports and how does it create these relationships between the athlete and the coach, or a parent and their child? Does it even the relationships amongst the athletes themselves? So it looks at how do they provide a network of friendships in those different sports. So again, you can take it sort of will guide you on how you approach a different topic. You'll find in each chapter as you move forward, there are nice tables of sort of each theory. If you'll get practice. It's sort of a cumulative way of looking at the different theories. We're going to continue to look at the different theories when we look at each topic as we approach it. Gender, race, age, religion, education. We'll always revisit the different theoretical perspectives. So you'll see a table like this, and it'll help if you are the type of student that likes to look, do index cards. This would be a great place to kind of write your index cards. Grab the information from here. What is the key concept? What is the view of society? What level of analysis? Is it a macro level or is it a micro level approach? Okay, last thing I want to mention here this last module is really just defining the different types of sociology. Not that any of you, if you did decide to become a sociologist, these are the different types of sociology. We have applied sociology, which uses sociology with a specific intent, yielding practical applications for human behavior and organizations. I would be considered an applied sociologist when I was working full-time in the organization. I worked in a healthcare organization, so the research that I conducted was in the hopes to benefit the organization. I looked at patient satisfaction, and so I wrote surveys, and so those surveys yielded results that helped improve the organization. Clinical sociology is dedicated to looking at altering social relationships or even restructuring institutions like the family. So many clinical sociologists may be working in, social work or family, facilities where, family therapy facilities, suicide hotlines, those sorts of things where people need that sort of clinical help and, assistance in sort of seeking out that sort of clinical approach. And basic sociology is more of the academics, seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake, studying and creating, maybe developing new theories, examining a social phenomenon, and looking at, developing sociology for, again, the knowledge that it can bring to various parts of society. And so that's really the basic different types of approaches. And really, we view this on a spectrum. So, one end it's the basic sociology, and then we kind of move forward. And then public sociology, which isn't listed here, is another, where we look at sociology and we, help government organizations and give advisement to that level of help with our sociological background. Okay, so that's pretty much the sum of chapter 1. We're going to move on to chapter 2 next.